Hello and welcome to Chapter 11, Conflict Management and Negotiation. We've previously been discussing power and how we influence others to achieve certain goals. Now we're going to be transferring to conflict management and negotiation. Conflict is inevitable and unavoidable. So, we have to strive to find ways to manage conflict and to hopefully get to win-win scenarios. And it also means negotiating with others and finding strategies to achieve our objectives more often. So, this is what we're going to be discussing today, but first let's define it. What is conflict? Conflict is the expressed struggle. So, if it is not expressed, it is not conflict. Of interconnected parties, if parties are not interconnected, connected in some way, shape, or form, then it is not a conflict, who perceive incompatible goals, meaning that if for me to achieve my goal, the other person does not, can't achieve their goal, then there's conflict. But it is perceived just because or else we would not be able to find win-win scenarios. And the interference from each other in attaining those goals, so that there is interference between each party to achieve that certain goal. There are great benefits to engaging in conflict. Moderate amounts of conflict can be a constructive force in groups if the conflict is managed competently. So it relies on competent communication. And if not for this competent communication, then it can end up being destructive. Destructive conflict is characterized by dominating, escalating, retaliating, competing, actively acting defensively and inflexibly. So, those are bad and can end up causing a relationship deterioration or group deterioration, and funny enough can even erode the immune system. Whereas we have constructive conflict, which is characterized by a we orientation instead of just a me orientation, de-escalating, cooperative, supportive, and flexible communication patterns. Constructive conflict is harder to engage in than destructive conflict, but the benefits are vast to have constructive conflict, so that's what we are going to strive to achieve. Conflict can remain constructive even when discussion becomes somewhat contentious, because it remains within the bounds of dynamic equilibrium. So, even if it gets contentious, it can still be constructive. Even if we disagree, we can still have constructive conflict. And even if we don't achieve our goals, if we still engage in constructive conflict, the relationship can flourish and the group can flourish. So let's talk about the styles of conflict management. There are many. Uh, there's avoidance, accommodation, compromise, collaboration, and competition. So when we talk about uh, since conflict can be an essential catalyst for growth in a system, increasing conflicts may be required to evoke change in a system. So, avoid. There are many things that we can account for within these styles. The big ones are levels of cooperation versus levels of competitiveness. When levels of cooperation are high, accommodation and cooperation are the most adapted to this range. Whereas when levels of competitiveness are high, we're more likely to engage in competition, but also collaboration. So we want to find those balances. Another thing to keep in mind, replace levels of cooperation with relationship. If we do not care about the relationship, avoidance is more likely to occur if we are of low levels of competitiveness as well. If we care, in the same way, levels of competitiveness can be replaced with task. When we have high task concern, then we have competition and collaboration. So, First, we're going to be talking about collaboration. And since collaboration has the highest level of concern for the task as well as highest concern for the relationship, it is probably the most ideal, but there are some certain challenges associated with it. So we should always strive for collaboration of some kind. Collaboration is win-win, a cooperative approach to conflict that attempts to satisfy all parties, that everyone gets exactly what they want. This is not compromise, it is that we both get exactly what we want. And someone employing this style balances high concern for both task and social relationships and groups. So there's three key ways that we engage in this collaboration. First, we have confrontation. This is directly addressing the problem. The overt recognition that conflict exists in a group and direct effort to manage it effectively. Confrontation as a conflict management technique incorporates all the elements already discussed at length regarding assertiveness, so which is reflected through the steps of describing, expressing, specifying, and identifying consequences, as well as supportive communication, description, problem orientation, equality, provisionalism, things like that. So in general, it is an overt recognition of the conflict, but it is doing it in a way that is assertive and supportive. Not all issues are worth confronting, though. Sometimes, obviously, if, you know, my younger sibling wants a candy bar, and I kind of want the candy bar too, and then they snatch it and then eat it anyway, I may not confront that issue because it may not be worth confronting. Next, we talk to integration. Integration is seeking joint gains, and this is a creative approach of conflict to conflicts of interest. It searches for solutions that benefit both people. So, there are two key forms though, expanding the pie and bridging. Expanding the pie is increasing the resources as a solution to the problem. For example, if let's say that there's a big lump of money and 5 people have a right to it. At that point, how can we solve this? Well, what we could all do is we could all invest this money into something and therefore gain from that large investment. Or that we wait for it to accumulate and then we get exactly how much that original lump sum was. We all get what we want, exactly what we want, through an integrated means. We also have bridging. Bridging considers the goals of all parties in conflict and offers a new option that satisfies the interests of everyone involved. So, it is providing a new option. For example, if 2 people are fighting about, let's say 2 parents, they're arguing about who gets to keep the child. Uh, what should be the balance of when each person gets the child? If the most important part of that situation is that the child stays in a certain home, in one home, then it may be ripe for conflict. But if there is a new solution, like the parents move from home to home, then that could be that sort of bridging, that new option that satisfies the interests of everyone. So, how do we engage in integration? First, parties in conflict must determine that the real conflict even exists, a conflict of interest even exists. Then we have to, the parties in disagreement should stick to their goals, but remain flexible in how to attain them. So that we shouldn't focus, so we should maintain consistency on our goals, but just flexible about how to achieve them. Then, if stalemated, or we can't reach a goal or solution, then we should then try to concede lower priority issues or discard low priority interests altogether, therefore getting to collaboration. And since conflict is challenging and ripe for emotion, Smoothing can sometimes help as well. The act of calming the agitated feelings of group members during a conflict episode is required in this collaborative conflict management strategy. Collaborating usually requires, so let's talk about collaborating as a whole again. Collaborating usually requires significant time and effort investment, along with greater than ordinary communication skills. So, in some groups where time investment and effort are not uh, produced by all, then it can be very challenging. And collaboration is also built on trust, meaning that if the relational context isn't there as well, it could potentially lead to some challenges as well. So, parties in conflict sometimes do not share the same emotional investment in finding mutually agreeable solutions. So, as a result, collaboration might not be the possible at that time. Next, we talk about accommodating. Accommodating is yielding. Someone using this style would have a high concern for the social relationship, but low concern for the task accomplishment. Generally, group members of less power are more likely to accommodate to those of higher power to a more often degree. That one's common, and if it is done in a way that take up the role of the martyr, oh, you always get what you want. Yeah, your group, you get whatever you want. I don't care. You aren't going to listen to me anyway. At that point, then it is obviously not appreciated and can hurt the group uh, and diminish the social benefits of accommodation. Lastly, we have one of the few lasts. We have compromising. We give up something to get something. This someone showing this style has moderate concern for both the task and the relationship. Compromise can be useful when an integrative solution cannot be achieved, so we can't get what we want through creative problem solving. When a temporary settlement is the only feasible alternative, or when the issues involved are not considered critical to the group. For example, if it is, well, I mean, yeah, in general, if it's not something that's essential or very important for the group, compromise might be the best option. But it tends to have a unrealistically positive association because why have, because compromising is easy, sure, but it also is in essence a lose-lose situation because we don't get exactly what we want. We may get some of what we want, but not exactly what we want. So next we talk about avoiding. This is withdrawing from the communication situation. Communicating the style of withdrawing from potentially contentious and unpleasant struggles. Someone using this avoiding conflict style has little concern for both the task and the social relationship. But avoiding is sometimes appropriate especially when confronting the problem, the conflict, is counterproductive. For example, if someone is, if two people are breaking up and one person wants to break up, the other person doesn't, then uh, the advantages of confronting the issue do not outweigh the advantages of removing yourself from the situation and avoiding the conflict. Because what's the worst thing that can happen? Break up with me twice? Not going to work. So, nevertheless, in most cases, avoiding rather than confronting is highly counterproductive. Lastly, we talk about competing. Competing is power forcing, approaching conflict as a win-lose context, and this is not being assertive or doing confrontation. It is instead aggressive, not assertive, and it is an attack on the other person. It is, in other words, attacking the other person, beating them, and then once I've beaten them in this conflict, then I have therefore won. Someone using this competing style has high task concern but low concerned relationship. And this is an incredibly common conflict style in American culture due to our hyper competitiveness. So let's take a step back. Research clearly favors some conflict styles over others. Guess what? Collaboration is highly beneficial to the group, so there's a lot of research on it. But we seem to use the least effective styles most often to manage conflict in relationships. So we need to check ourselves. We need to understand that our natural inclination is towards the least effective style. So we have to flex those other muscles even though we don't want to, or other styles. Even if the style with greatest likelihood for success is chosen, when and how it is used must also be figured into the equation. For example, confrontation used as a collaborative tactic can be highly effective, but it won't be if it's used in a hit and run fashion. This is the how it is used. So for example, if I give someone a concern and then run away, not going to be super effective. Versus competing. Competing power forcing should be a style of last resort, except in times of emergency, when quick, decisive action must be taken and discussion has no place. For example, if the building is on fire, then of course competing has to be the primary goal. A competing conflict style. So we've talked about the conflict management styles, but there are some factors, situational factors that need to be accounted for. Although some conflict styles have higher probability of effectiveness than others, the choice of styles always operates within the context. First, we're going to be talking about the types of conflict, and then the culture, how culture affects conflict. First, we have the different types of conflict for task, relationship, and value. Task conflict revolves around routine tasks and non-routine. Routine tasks are group are that the group performs processes and procedures that have little variability and likelihood of change. So, for example, how do people protest? Protest is in essence a conflict. And that is done through all of these routine tasks. But arguing against these routine tasks, a conflict about these routine tasks, is not going to help us, is actually going to hurt us in a lot of different ways. Whereas when we have conflict about non-routine tasks, one that requires problem solving, has a few set procedures, and has a high level of uncertainty, then that is something that we can have conflict about and is less likely to lead to destructive conflict. We also have relationship conflict. This is where we make style choices depending on the relationship with group members. For example, how are you going to have conflict with your younger sibling, or your parent, or your teacher, or your pastor, whatever? So we do adapt to the relationship given the conflict. Also, conflict initially about task accomplishment can easily lead to a relationship conflict. uh, for example, if someone's acting in a way that is disconfirming or uh, highly competitive, it could very easily transfer to a relationship conflict. And then establishing trust among group members is a key component necessary to prevent task conflict from mutating to the relationship conflict. And then lastly, we have values, and values are our deeply felt struggles. So this is very ripe to create destructive conflict, so needs to be done in collaborative means. Values and they're usually about values and beliefs. Values being our deeply held, felt views on what is deemed good, worthwhile, or ethically right, whereas beliefs are what is true or probable. Next, we talk about culture. Culture affects everything. this is one of those things as well. Culture can vary widely in their preferences for communication styles of conflict management. Conflict from with individuals and groups from other cultures. So in other words, so sorry, conflicts from individuals and groups from other cultures or the out group are often handled differently in collectivistic cultures than are conflicts within the in groups. So in essence, collectivistic cultures tend to deal with in-group people one way and out-group people another way. And individualistically, that's different. Also, in an individualistic culture, we tend to communicate with people the same, or conflict management the same with both. Remaining flexible by employing a style that is well suited to cultural expectations is a key to effective conflict management in such situations. So we have to be adaptable to cultural expectations. But that being said, remaining flexible when managing cross-cultural conflict means more than just adapting to the conflict styles of typical cultural expectations of appropriateness. Instead, it also means adapting to individuals who may not embrace predominant cultural values. So basically the name of the game of how to engage in intercultural conflict management is to adapt often and always. So let's now talk about negotiation strategies. Negotiation is a process by which a joint decision is made by two or more parties. Negotiation strategies are the ways that we therefore transact these joint decisions when conflict does arise. There's four key takeaways from negotiation strategies. First, positional bargaining, principled negotiation, remaining unconditionally constructive, and then the Batna, or the best alternative to negotiated agreement. So, let's start with positional bargaining. There's hard and soft negotiation. Hard bargainers see it as a contest of wills and a competing forcing strategy. Walking out on the negotiations in a huff, refusing to budge even on trivial issues, issuing ultimatums like take it or leave it, exhibiting negative emotions through facial expressions like anger and contempt, and dominating the space are commonplace verbal and nonverbal tactics in hard positional bargaining. So, that position, as we can no doubt tell, is very high task oriented, very low relationship oriented. But the key to making hard bargaining a constructive conflict strategy is to appear tough and fair, tough but fair. So, as with any competitive strategy, when hard bargainers face off against each other, then it can very easily produce an impasse just due to the transactional moves and counter moves. Soft bargainers recognize the high costs of hard bargaining on relationships, so therefore are more likely to yield to the pressure of a hard bargainer. Next, we talk about principled negotiation. This is interest-based bargaining, and this is highly valuable. This is the difference. This is the middle between hard bargaining and soft bargaining, because hard bargaining is ripe to create challenges and impasses, whereas soft bargaining is just not to get what we want. Principled negotiation is smack dab in the middle. Active listening is an overarching component. Uh, uh, com- uh, is an overarching competent communication imperative for successful principled negotiation. There are four key fundamentals of principled negotiation. First, we should separate people from problems. It's not me arguing against you, it's us trying to find a solution to this problem. Also, interest-based focusing on interests instead of positions. We'll talk about what they are, but in general, to focus on what we want instead of winning our position. Also, we want to generate options for mutual benefit and use objective criteria instead of subjective criteria. So, Let's talk a little bit about it. With principled negotiation, we should empower all parties to feel on equal footing, safe to express their viewpoints by employing a rule that requires that everyone treat each other with respect throughout the negotiations. So this speaks to that active listening component of competent communication, especially within negotiation. We also should strive to be interest oriented, not position oriented, or focus on interests, not positions. Where positions are concrete things one party wants, whereas interests are the intangible motivations, needs, desires, concerns, fears, aspirations that lead a party in the conflict to take a position. That's an important distinction because if we focus on interests, then we could absolutely have the exact same interests but have taken two positions. So instead of us arguing for the position that we want, we are instead arguing for the certain interests that we want, therefore finding solutions. Generating a variety of options is another aspect of principled negotiation, so that we are therefore and in a grander scheme, decision-making processes through the standard agenda. We should also strive to remain unconditionally constructive. We tend to adopt those conflict strategies that the other person is using, therefore creating conflict spirals. For example, if someone acts in a competing conflict style, then I am likely to also do that until we end up creating an escalatory cycle. The same thing can be true of avoiding that. Instead, that one person avoids the conflict, then the other person avoids the conflict, and the other person, and the other person, and the other person, until it does not eventually happen. All of which creates this escalatory cycle. Being unconditionally constructive means you make choices and take only those actions that benefit both you and the other parties in the dispute, regardless of whether the other party reciprocates. And that's very interesting because if you do that, then the other person will feel pressure to then give some for you as well to reciprocate. Research shows, though, that labeling the hard bargaining tactic as ineffective and refusing to reciprocate bad bargaining behavior effectively refocuses the negotiation on interest based issues and then prevents conflict styles or hard bargaining conflict styles. So, we should strive to remain unconditionally constructive. Lastly, we have the Batna. The Batna is the best alternative to negotiated agreement. This is what the Batna tells you what is the best you can do if negotiation fails to produce agreement. That is important and helps you prevent making mistakes because because that might be better than what the other person has to offer. And as a result, you can then avoid making that mistake. So if conflict was logical, then we'd be able to go through all these systems and be totally fine, solving every problem and be ready to go. But it is not entirely logical. In fact, anger is a big part of conflict, and that can make it destructive conflict. So we are going to be discussing further, first, defining what is constructive and destructive anger, managing your own anger, and then managing the anger of others through communication jujitsu. So we start with constructive and destructive anger. This is defined through two components, intensity and duration. If intensity and duration of anger expressions are high, then anger is destructive. If it is low, then it is constructive. Rage or high intensity and duration, that is destructive, obviously. And funny enough, venting anger, despite popular notions, actually doesn't reduce anger. In fact, it can actually rehearse the anger and increase it. Give you an example: if someone cuts you off on the road, you get angry. Then you vent that anger. Oh my gosh, how did they do that? They're so selfish. They're so rude, blah, 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 blah. Then the next time someone does that, you then feel the same way and get even more angry about it. So, learning how to manage this anger is an indicator of emotional intelligence. Constructive anger is important, though. If someone is angry about a certain situation that they deem unfair, then they will actually be more likely to engage it if they feel anger about that situation. Now let's talk about managing our own anger or taking control of this anger. There are several steps you can take to diffuse your own anger when you sense that it is approaching that destructive stage of intensity and duration. It does not mean that anger in total, again, is something that should be avoided. In fact, that constructive anger is important, but there are ways to reduce it when it gets destructive. Reframing self talk. Instead of the person being rude, maybe it's a situational factor. Instead of my sister not caring about who I am as a person, instead, maybe she just really wanted to watch that episode of Kim Kardashian, which is why she decided to throw something at me. I don't know. We also want to be sure that we're listening non defensively. This means taking in what they say and not automatically judging the other person. We also want to wag more and bark less. This, frankly, means that we should not express our anger a lot of times. Again, venting can increase our anger. So, we may just, okay, that's pretty bad. That's pretty messed up that they did that. But what are you going to do? Also, deliberately calming yourself. This means just taking that deep breath and finding ways to calm yourself. And then even finding distractions. If something's really getting you angry, you may want to distract yourself from that situation by focusing on something else. So don't attempt to employ all of these different steps at once. Instead, use one and then try to work that out because they're all very hard to do, frankly. And now let's talk about how we manage anger with others. This is communication jujitsu, where we act in ways that instead of them attacking and then me being symmetrical with that, instead we act in asymmetrical ways or find ways to engage that people may not see coming so that it therefore removes some of their anger. First, being asymmetrical. When someone yells at you, instead listen. When someone is, avoiding you, instead try to engage them further. Or, say, hey, here, I'm going to give you this sheet of paper. We'll talk at another time. Whatever time you want to meet, go ahead and write it on that piece of paper and we can go ahead and discuss it. And then leave them. At that point, it's not escalating, it's being asymmetrical. We also validate the other person by showing that we understand them and that they are not being crazy in this situation. That can be incredibly confirming, thereby reducing anger. We also want to probe, asking those probing questions to get at the root of what they're mad about or to better understand their position. We may even also want to distract, to find a different thing to talk about if anger has been is too high. Also, we could assume a problem orientation, focusing on the problem instead of the person. Refuse to be abused. This one's incredibly important. It means that instead of just letting them abuse you through bullying, for example, we then address it through confrontation, but in a collaborative way. And then lastly, we disengage. This means, if temper has gone too high, you may simply say, you know what, the tempers have gotten too high. I feel like we should continue this conversation at a later date and then leave immediately. That reduces a lot of the tension. So concentrating on one or two of these steps until they become a reflex reaction or a habit is essential for these things to be effective. It does take practice, like any other communication strategy. That concludes this chapter. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.